I'm Grant Threlkeld, and this is my Module 8 case study. For a summary, Mrs. Green is a new special education teacher who's taken over for a 25-year special education teacher. She works for a cooperative that provides the special education services. Mrs. Taylor is a third grade teacher at the same school as Mrs. Green and has at least one of Mrs. Green's students. This student, Carl, has a behavior plan who has been overall successful with the behavior plan. However, starting in about the sixth week of school, Mrs. Taylor has mentioned that Carl's behavior has begun escalating to the point that Mrs. Taylor doesn't feel safe and is concerned with the safety of her students. Carl's family has recently gone through a divorce, which at times was heated to the point of law enforcement being called. Carl has two siblings who are receiving support for emotional needs. What do I know? Mrs. Green is a new special education teacher. She took over for a 25-year special education icon in the building. Carl is a third grade student with behavior concerns. His parents are recently divorced. Mrs. Taylor is his third grade teacher, and recently there has been some aggression, including throwing pencils and throwing rocks from the bus that started in the sixth week of school, although Mrs. Taylor says that the aggression is only directed towards her. Mrs. Taylor is a respected teacher within the district, and when asked to collaborate, Mrs. Taylor voiced just wanting Carl out of her room. Mrs. Green has talked to others, including the superintendent and the district coordinator for special education, to help develop a plan for Carl to remove himself from situations when frustration reaches the breaking point. After discussing this plan with multiple people, an IEP meeting was attempted to be scheduled. After several attempts, the meeting was scheduled, and anecdotal notes suggest that the divorce process was heated. The meeting started with Mrs. Taylor stating a positive about Carl being a cute boy, but then stated that she didn't know if her classroom was the right place for Carl. Mrs. Hughes, Carl's mom, placed some of the blame at Mr. Hughes' feet, stating that since the divorce she had to work 50 hours a week and was never home, and that Mr. Hughes had not seen Carl recently. Mom asked about giving Carl his brother's medicine, and it was recommended that she talk to her doctor. Mr. Hughes stated that he needed to get back to work, wanted the papers to be signed papers, and left the meeting. Mom stayed for the duration of the meeting and stated that she is trying to be a good mom and indicated that she was going to talk to Carl about his behavior. After the meeting, Mrs. Taylor mentioned how the previous special education teacher would handle similar situations with just removing the students from the classroom, having them go to a separate location, and do workbook pages. Mrs. Green has observed Mrs. Taylor's class and could not see a pattern for the outbursts. When Carl was asked about the outburst, he would hang his head and would not have an answer. Carl's psychological file does not indicate that he has an intellectual delay, nor was there data at this time to support more intensive behavioral or academic needs. What do I need to know? What's Mrs. Taylor's previous special education experience? Has she had other students in her classroom and this was their experience as well of just being pulled from the classroom? What was the paperwork that was signed? It doesn't say that it was an IEP. It doesn't say that there was consent required. But when it comes to consent, one of the parental rights is that they have informed consent. And with the meeting happening as fast as it did before Mr. Hughes left, I'm not sure that informed consent was given because it went from Carl is a cute boy to he needs to be pulled from the classroom. And other options were not presented, nor was the data prior to Mr. Hughes leaving, according to the information that we were given. And if there was a disagreement on service between the appropriate placement of the student, between what Mrs. Taylor thought and what Mrs. Green thought, what did the LEA representative do? Or what did the administrator do? Because they hold the final judgment in IEP meetings. Is Mrs. Taylor the only teacher seeing the more aggressive behaviors? Have any other third grade teachers seen it? Was it seen in second grade? What has it been seen in PE or music, or is this a new developing situation? Are is the staff trained on physical assists, restraints, or escorts just to make sure that we're in compliance with the legal components and making sure that we're respecting the rights of the child? And how recent was his 3-year reevaluation stating that his IQ was in the average range? Because it may be time for an update. What's the problem? One of the problems is training with the staff on the least restrictive environment and making sure that we're making all attempts to keep the student in the general education classroom if possible. But Carl also needs a way of being able to manage his frustrations. Mrs. Taylor needs support strategies to be used to help de-escalate Carl when he is becoming agitated, and she also needs help on how to form positive relationships with Carl and the rest of the students so that all students can be successful. And the parents need positive affirmation of Carl's progress. They have a lot going on just between themselves, and if we as the school community are continuing to dump on them of how their child is not being successful in school, we're not helping to end the cycle of frustration. For the plan of action, first I'd want to have a meeting with the school team members to refresh the IEP and what's to be expected from the behavior plan and collecting data and planning out when to reevaluate the data. Then plan the next steps and a follow-up IEP meeting. Again, because I'm not 100% sure that informed consent was given, I would want to be able to see more concrete data on what we're seeing from Carl so that then if it needs to go the medicine route, that Mr. and Mrs. Hughes have the data that they can take to the doctor. That if it's something else within the school setting, that we have the data to show what's happening. So that then if we need to move placement, we have the data to back it up. Second, I'd work with the school counselor and social worker to see about getting him in groups to develop the peer relationships that he's going to need. Third, I would want to work with Mrs. Green and Mrs. Taylor on developing their working relationship so that it becomes less of a Mrs. Green against Mrs. Taylor, but more that they're sitting on the same side of a table helping to advocate what's best for Carl. I would also want to work on making walkthroughs a more prominent point within the classroom so that the LEA representative at an IEP meeting can play a more active role than merely a signatory. I would want to follow up with Carl and work with him on requesting a break on his own and developing a stable peer group with him. While it's important for him to have adults that he can trust in his life, he's also going to need a stable group of peers so that way if he's having a tough time over a break, that he's got friends that he can go hang out with and talk to and have those moments of being a child. I'd like to follow up with the parents on strategies that are working and are not working at school and seeing what is working at home. I'd want to emphasize what is working, but also point out what isn't working so that way parents can see that we too at school sometimes struggle with students and that it's not just them. And then work with them on what's working at home so that way we can help build that relationship and that trust between the school and the parent. And if not currently being done, I would want to work on getting the staff trained on physical assists, escorts, and restraints so that we can respect Carl and his needs, but also make sure that we are in compliance with the law. Lastly, I'd want to start developing monthly trainings on special education policies and to develop better staff relationships. To resolve the issue, Carl needs support to help him develop appropriate strategies in handling frustration. This can be done through individual work with a school counselor or through social work groups, with him being the regular education model student. Again, building that confidence in himself and getting him to see that school is a safe environment. And Carl needs a group of peers who will help him create the connections that he needs. Mrs. Green needs support from administration to more properly implement special education policies. If it was as done previously where students were very quickly pulled from the regular education classroom, that has to be changed. And that's going to take some time and some support. Mrs. Taylor needs support in making sure that she can successfully teach all students and foster positive relationships with her students. With understanding the problem, what am I thinking? I'm thinking that Mrs. Green has a tough road ahead of her. Changing the the influence within the school is difficult to do, especially taking over for someone who had been there for so long. Carl currently has many distractions in his life that aren't necessarily helping. He seems to be dealing with a lot of adult problems within his childhood. And I'm concerned for his parents and how they communicate with each other and with their children. If Carl is struggling with frustration and how to properly handle that, and it's not being modeled for him at home, then that's an issue. What am I feeling? I'm feeling compassion for all the parties. They each want what they perceive as what's best. However, they're not communicating with each other effectively. And what am I valuing? I'm valuing the process that Mrs. Green is starting. It's going to be a long road, but it's going to be what's best for the school community and for the students. And I value Carl's potential. If he can be taught that school is a safe place for him, he can experience success. Unresolved issues. I don't know if the experience described by Mrs. Taylor and students being pulled quickly from their classroom is an isolated incident or if it has been happening throughout the building. And if that's the case, I'd want to follow up with all the teachers. I'm not sure how Carl's classmates view him and how that's affecting his relationships with his peers. At young ages, children have a tendency to forgive each other for quirks. However, I would hate for Carl to receive a label from his peers that would potentially be detrimental to him down the road. I'm not sure if the paperwork signed is a valid IEP or if the school needs to be following the previous IEP due to the concerns about informed consent discussed earlier in this video. And I'm not sure what the LEA representative was doing during the meeting to help maintain order and to help keep the flow going so that both parents could have been there for as long as necessary to get the meeting accomplished. How am I promoting academic success? Well, number one, Carl needs to be in the classroom as much as possible to experience success. And so we're going to be implementing the behavior plan with Carl with breaks that will give him the opportunity to be successful in the best learning environment for him. I'd like to continue to work on collaboration. It doesn't seem through the material given that collaboration was used or pre-meetings were used to help address the concerns that Mrs. Taylor and Mrs. Green had working together as a part of a team. Instead, they seemed to have their own ideologies that walked into the meeting and then helped to create some conflict. Walkthroughs. Even though there isn't always a principal there, I'd like to see teachers see other teachers teach and to be able to give input to help break down the walls of the classroom so that we can all learn with and from each other. How am I promoting the well-being of the students? Through utilizing the resources, through a counselor, social worker. Carl can be given some adults that he can depend on in his life. How to talk to parents. In the IEP meeting, Mrs. Taylor did give a positive about Carl being a cute boy. However, that's not something that's affected by the school environment. And if that's all that we have to say about a child is how they look, that doesn't necessarily give parents the confidence in the school system. In friendship, more than staff members, Carl's going to need a strong group of friends that are going to travel with him from grade to grade. They can help him through this trying time and can help him over breaks and can allow Carl to be a child. How am I promoting instructional capacity? More training on the least restrictive environment and making sure that we understand that all children are general education students first, with training on behavior and making sure that before we implement any sort of physical escort that the staff needs training on what to do, and then follow up on data collection to make sure that we have accurate and specific data regarding academics and behavior so that we can make the best decisions. Thanks for watching.